Okay, right, I think we're good to go. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Just before we kick off this afternoon session, can I just remind you of the conversation we had last week? I mentioned to you about the program we would like to do called Desert Island Discs, where you nominate a disc that has some meaning to you, and then we can put a program together based on the number of you contributing. Thank you for those that responded last week. We actually had, I think, about 8 or 9 people, and we will get back in touch with you soon. It's not due to happen till probably October, so we've got a little bit of time. But if there are any of you that have not yet contributed and would like to do so, can I just remind you of our email address, which is bushysage@gmail.com. Just tell us the piece of music that is of interest to you, and when we get back to you, then you can start to put some words together around that. So please feel free to do that. The more the merrier, and if we get more than one program together on that, that'll be good as well. Okay, right, good afternoon again, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome Melvyn Leach here this afternoon. Melvyn's title on the presentation he's doing to us is My Cousin Who Hid from the Nazis in Belgium. Melvyn is going to recall the story of his cousin Willy, who in 1942, as a 9-year-old Jewish boy, was taken by the resistance in Belgium. He spent the rest of World War II as a hidden child. He never saw his parents again. Willy is now in his late 80s, but in 2014, Melvyn accompanied Willy when he returned to Belgium to research his history. So Melvyn, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting me come into your homes. As you heard, I'm going to tell the story of my cousin Willy, who was a hidden child in the war in Belgium. A couple of things. I'll take questions at the end, and as part of my presentation, there are 2 videos. The second, well, they both have sound, but the second, just a warning, it starts off with a blank screen, and then you'll see some words, and you won't hear any sound until you see a keyboard. So don't start adjusting your computers thinking that you might not be able to hear, because it won't be on then. So I'm now going to try and share the screen so you can see my presentation. So, can you see a screen of Willy's story?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay. So, here is a photo of myself and my cousin Willy, and this was taken last September. Willy was 86, and that's in his flat in Toronto, which is turned into an artist studio. Now, first of all, let me explain Willy's relationship to me. I call Willy my cousin. He's actually married to my wife's cousin. Marilyn and Willy and my wife Anne and myself are very good friends apart from being cousins. And we've been on holiday together, we've stayed with them, and they stayed with us. And we're very, very close. And this journey started in 2011 when Marilyn and Willy were staying at our house, and Willy explained to me that he wanted to tell the story of his time in the war, which I'd never heard about, and he wanted to write it down so that he could tell it to his sons. I'm going to tell you the story of Willy's story. I'm going to tell 3 stories in parallel. Firstly, the story of Willy as a 9-year-old Jewish boy living in Belgium during the Second World War. And then the story of that 9-year-old boy when he was 80, trying to remember what happened to him during the war. And the third story is my story of me accompanying Willy on a visit to Belgium and the research that we carried out. But before I tell you about those stories, I thought it important to put Willy's story in an historical context. So on May the 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Belgium. It took only 18 days to put the country under military rule, and that lasted until the liberation by the Allies in 1944. So what did Europe under the Nazis look like? And this is a map of Europe in 1942. 1942 is an important year in Willy's story. So all of the countries in red are under Nazi occupation, and all the countries in pink are allies of the Nazis. So as you can see, the Nazi regime was spread very, very wide. And as we're talking about what happened in Belgium, I think it's important to see what this meant for the 70,000 Jews who were living in Belgium at that time. Well, the Nazis deported Jews out of Belgium. And it's interesting to note that most of the 70,000 Jews who were living in Belgium at the time were mostly foreign and recently arrived stateless refugees who were in fact fleeing from the Nazis. Of the 70,000, 25,000 were deported, and most were murdered in the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Of the 25,000 who were deported, only 2,000 survived. Some of the Jewish population avoided deportation by hiding from the authorities, and Willy was one of these. So the German occupation of Belgium had devastating consequences for the Jews living there. And there was a German military administration that coexisted with the Belgian civil service. And one of the big surprises for me in the research and trip that I did with Willy is how the Belgian civil service cooperated with the Nazi invaders. And one example is this notice. And any French readers who are looking at this will know that this notice, which is an instruction from the German military authorities, which is supported and administered by the Belgian civil service, which instructs everybody who is Jewish that they have to report to the town hall or other public office to register themselves as Jews and have the word Jew stamped on their registration documents. And if you see down there, you can see it's signed by the mayor. And at the documents that Willy and I looked at, we could see that the civil service was cooperating. So the Germans came along and put in anti-Jewish laws, which restricted the civil rights of Jews. And the top right hand of this slide, you can see a notice that had to go up in all Jewish shops, cafes, and so on, to say that this is a Jewish shop. Jewish people had their property confiscated and Jewish businesses were confiscated. Kosher meat was banned. Jews were banned from certain professions. And from 1942, Jews were required to wear the yellow Star of David. And you can see that there's a Jewish boy, a Belgian Jewish boy, wearing that star. Jews in Belgium were also rounded up for forced labor. Now, what was happening in Belgium was known to the outside world. This is a document from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency in New York, and their reporter in Stockholm reported the following: Nazis impose curfew upon Brussels. Jews in Brussels may not leave their homes between the hours of 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. under a new order issued by the German military commander of the city. It is reported in the Brüsseler Zeitung, reaching here today. Travelling elsewhere than within the area of Brussels, Antwerp, Liège and Charleroi is also forbidden to Jews. These measures have been taken because, quote, Jews have been abusing the liberty they have enjoyed, unquote. The Nazi-controlled Belgian paper states. So you get a flavour of what it was like for Jews in Belgium. A very unpleasant situation to find yourself in. That's the situation that Willy and his family were living in. So let's now turn to Willy's story. In 2011, when Willy and Marilyn were staying with us, he decided to write his story. And he explained to us that after the war, Willy, like many other survivors, shut off his past. And he said that he decided as a teenager, if I thought about the past, I couldn't move forward. And Willy decided to write the story for his two sons. So this was a discussion that was happening in our lounge one afternoon. And Willy said, I don't know where to start. So I said to him, well, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Not quite knowing what I was letting myself in for. So I said, well, let's sit at the computer. And I started to write a timeline, starting with Willy's birthday. And we went up until the point that Willy decided to go and live in Israel. And we tried to fill in some of the gaps. And Willy showed me this photo. And this photo shows Willy with his two sisters, his mother, his father, and his aunt in a park near to where they lived in Antwerp. And until we did our research, this was the only photo that Willy had of his parents and his aunt. And so Willy started to explain to me what happened during the war. And Willy said one summer's day in 1942, he was walking with his dad in the street in Antwerp. And all of a sudden, everything went quiet. Both ends of the street were closed by the German SS, aided by the Belgian brown shirt collaborators. And they approached Willy and his dad. Willy's father, who had been in the resistance, had been tipped off that the SS knew about him and he was in immediate danger. Willy's dad thought very quickly how to save his son. And they were standing next to a non-Jewish resistance member. And so Willy's father pushed Willy towards the other man and said loudly enough for the Nazis to hear, "Go to your father, I have to go." Willy's father took his revolver and put it down the sewer. And the man took Willy by the shoulders, walked him away and said, "Don't look back. Everything's going to be fine." And that was the last Willy saw of his father. The man took Willy and put him in the back of a van on his own and drove for a few hours. And when Willy got out of the van, he arrived at a place with a scary dragon. And he was met by a Catholic priest, and Willy explained this to me, and gave him a new name. And I said to Willy, "What was your new name?" And he said, "Willy van Hammer." And I said to him, "Well, that's very interesting that you kept your first name, Willy." And he said, "No, that wasn't my first name. My first name is really Akiba." So his real name is Akiba Halpert. I didn't know that until that point. So we stopped with the timeline. Willy had got quite upset by this point, and Willy went off somewhere in the house. And I turned to Google and typed in Akiba Halpert. And it took me to the Yad Vashem website. And on this website was a list of hidden children. And Akiba Halpert, listed with his sisters, was listed in a long list of hidden children. And it had the story of a very brave woman. Her name's Andre Gerlin Herzevici. She was born in 1921. And she belonged to a resistance organization, Comité de Défense des Juifs, which was an organization that helped to hide Jewish children. And this organization consisted of about 12, mostly non-Jewish people, who managed to hide several thousand Jewish children. And we'll come back to Andre Gerlin's story later. But we found on the website Willy's name. You can see it there about halfway down, together with his sisters, as a hidden child. Now, we later discovered that there were a number of registers that were kept in secret places. One had the name of the child and some information about them. Another book had the name of a child with a reference number. Another book had the reference number with their false name. Another book had the child's reference number and the reference number of a hidden location. And a different book had the reference number of the hidden location and the name of the hidden location. And all of these books were kept in separate, secret hiding places. And no one person knew where all the books were. So if one of the resistance workers was caught by the authorities, then they couldn't give out information that would lead to all of the children being found. And the resistance workers kept this information so that they hoped at the end of the war, the children could be reunited with their parents. So this is what we found out while Marilyn and Willy were at our house. And then Willy went back to Canada to carry on with the research to find out as much as he could. So from Canada, he did research by internet, letters, telephone calls. And Marilyn found two brothers living in the United States that incredibly had been living in the same place that Willy had been living in. And they met these people. And it was by meeting these two brothers that Willy found out about one of the hiding places that he lived in. But after a few years, it became very clear that to continue with the research, then Willy needed to go to Belgium to fill in the gaps. And so Willy and I went for 2 weeks in 2014. And it was 2 weeks of intensive research. And it was a very emotional 2 weeks. We looked in archives, saw original documentation of ID cards with Willy's family with the word Jew stamped on it. We found places where Willy had lived, and we met some very important people. And here are just a few photos showing Willy in all of these places. One of these places is the Jewish Museum in Brussels. And I mention that because just 2 weeks after our visit, there was an anti-Semitic terrorist attack in that museum where a gunman walked in, opened fire, and killed 4 people. Let's go back to that fateful day in 1942 when Willy's father was arrested. It was the 7th large Jewish roundup. Willy's father was arrested and Willy was taken into hiding. And Willy didn't know where he was in hiding until he met these two brothers in California. And Willy remembered his very first memory of arriving at this place. It was scary, and there was a dragon. Remember, he was only 9 when he got there. Well, these brothers told us it was a chateau, the Chateau de Belloy. That shows the journey that Willy travelled on from Antwerp to the chateau. It took 75 miles. Must have been a terrifying experience being in the back of a van on his own, having seen his father arrested and not knowing where he was going. And this is where he arrived, and that's the scary dragon at the chateau. It is in fact a beautiful place. And Willy had been in contact with the people who are living in the chateau now, and it's lived in by the same family as was living there when Willy was there as a boy. A prince called the Prince de Ligne and his family. And when we arrived at this beautiful chateau, there's a stately home that's open for people to visit. The prince said to Willy, "Welcome home. This was your home before it was mine." We were shown some really interesting documentation about the time that Willy was there. Just let me explain about the setup of what Willy arrived at. The chateau was owned by the prince's grandfather, and he seemed to be a very generous man. And during the summer months, he opened up the chateau as a holiday home for disadvantaged children. And as a consequence, there was the infrastructure there to house lots of children, several hundred children during the war. And the prince and his family opened up the chateau full time for the children of Belgian people, where the children had no parents to look after them because of the war. They were predominantly Catholic, and the prince risked his life by welcoming some Jewish children in amongst this large number of non-Jewish children. Now, when Willy was there, he thought he was the only Jewish child there, as did a number of other Jewish children. We went on a tour, and this is the building where Willy lived. And the inside, they've kept it as much as they can. This is the children's bathroom. And what they would like to do is to turn this into a Holocaust museum with a special focus on hidden children and the role that this family played in hiding Jewish children during the war. We were treated to lunch. There's us having lunch with the prince and his family. And the prince, the current prince, Michel, he's very, very proud that he was invited to Israel, to Yad Vashem, to be presented with the medal and certificate, giving great honor to his grandfather, who was given the honor of a righteous Gentile for the work he did during the war in hiding Jewish children. This is his grandfather, Frederick. He had a university education. He was a working prince. He worked in the diplomatic service and came back to Belgium when the Germans invaded and joined the Belgian resistance. And he and his wife hid Jewish children. And as I said before, risked his life, because if he would have been found, that would have been the end of him. After the Second World War, he went back into work as the ambassador of Belgium in India and then Spain. So after a very nice lunch, we went back to the private quarters of the prince, and I think it will be the only time in my life where I was served coffee and chocolates by a prince and a princess. It was a very pleasant experience. And he showed us a special video that they've made where they managed to contact quite a number of the children who were hidden in the chateau and interviewed them, so that this memory is not lost and it's not forgotten. Now, Willy was there with other children. I say he didn't know there were other Jewish children, and everything was jogging along nicely. And then one day, he and about a dozen other children were told all of a sudden that they've got to leave. We subsequently discovered why they had to leave is that these children were here and their parents didn't know where they were. It was for everybody's safety. But somehow one of the parents had discovered that her child was living in the chateau and turned up to visit him. And if the Nazis and the collaborators would have discovered that, that would have been a great problem. So all of a sudden, Willy and some others were taken to another school, and Willy had worked out it was in a town called Melle, M-E-L-L-E, but he didn't know where that was. So he'd looked on the internet, and he thought that it may be to a building called Caritas. So on another day, we went to Melle, and Willy had made an appointment for us to come to this building. And soon after Willy got there and walked around, he said, no, this isn't the place. And our host, who was showing us around, said, as it happens, I know the local archivist. I'll see if he's available and see if he can help us find out where Willy actually stayed. So our host phoned up the archivist. The archivist said, yeah, please come along. And the archivist got some photos on his screen. There's the local archivist. And he got some photos on the screen of various places. And Willy looked at this photo, which is the dormitory of the Melle College. And Willy said, that's where I slept. So a phone call later, and we were in a car again, and we drove off to Melle College, who were not expecting us at all. They showed us around, and this was where Willy stayed. Now, as it happens, this college is one of the best schools in Belgium. Think of Eton, Harrow, it was that quality. And another one of the things that really shook me, and in an amazing way, is how many people risk their lives to save Jewish children. So we had the Prince, and there was a network of Catholic priests, Catholic schools that risked their lives to save Jewish children. And this was one such place. So we went on a tour of this school, amazing place. So they weren't expecting us. We went into the chapel, and Willy said, I remember this chapel. I used to sing as a boy soprano in this chapel. And Willy explained that he was in his family, he was brought up with a love of classical music. And he was quite traumatized, as you can imagine, by this, all this that was happening to him. And he said the only joy and peace he had was when he was singing beautiful music in the chapel. So I don't know whether you can see in the picture to the right of our visit to the chapel, at the end, there was a class. And it was a class of young children who were preparing for their first communion. And the teacher, being an excellent teacher, who was preparing her children to perform in front of an audience, saw an audience. There was the principal, that's the chap in the yellow jumper, Willy, myself, and a couple of other people from the school. So we sat at the front, and the children sang to Willy. And I'm going to show you a video clip of that. You can see Willy just on the right-hand side. And all the time he was listening to these children, he was picturing himself during the war singing there. Now, one of the things I'd ask you to notice is what the children look like, and particularly that most of them have got blonde hair. And just remember that, because we're going to come back to that a bit later on. So I've said this was a very good teacher who quickly adapted to having an audience. And when she heard that Willy was a hidden child during the war, she asked Willy to briefly explain to the children what happened to him, and for him to answer any questions. Now, you may have noticed, if you're good at identifying languages, that these children were speaking in Flemish, a kind of Dutch dialect. Now, Willy hadn't spoken that language since he left Belgium when he was about 14. And incredibly, he immediately switched into speaking fluent Flemish, answering their questions, and having a great rapport with them. It was a very moving moment. Now, the principal was really, really helpful. He stopped everything he was doing and got very involved in our visit. And he went to the school's archives, and he pulled out of the archives the register list of all the children that were there during the war. And there he is, looking for Willy van Hammer's name on the register, but he couldn't find it. And neither could he find the names of the two brothers that Willy had met in California, who were also at the school. And subsequently, we realized why. That every now and again, the local authorities would come and look for hidden children, and they would look on the register. And we also discovered that the public exam results, when they arrived, they were burnt, because the Jewish children's names were on the register, on the exam register. And one of the ways the authorities tried to find hidden children was to look on the register and compare it with the exam register. So there is actually no record of any Jewish child in the school on the register. So we found out where Willy was hidden during the war, and Willy also wanted to carry out research to find out what happened to his parents. So Willy had done a fantastic job in contacting archives and museums before we arrived, and he had arranged appointments for us to visit all of these museums and archives. And we went through the records, and this was a very upsetting and traumatic experience for Willy, to find out what happens to his parents, his aunts, uncles, cousins, and he was able to touch and see original documentation. So if you look at the top right hand of this slide, you can see that notice that told the Jewish population they had to go and register as Jews. And we found the registration cards of Willy's mother and father and Willy and his sisters, and that's what you can see on the screen, with the word Jew stamped on it. And this was a very, very chilling experience. You can imagine the range of emotions that Willy went through. And this is documentation that proves how the civil service collaborated with the Nazi authorities to identify Jews, process Jews, and have them identified for discrimination. There were various roundups where Jews were taken off the streets, taken from their home, forced out, and taken to some army barracks. And this is where they were taken. A place called Mechelen, and in Belgium, places often have two names. Malines is the other name. And this is a photograph taken in 1942 of shortly after the arrival of Jews from a roundup. And they were kept in these army barracks until there was about 1,000 of them, because that was a shipment that fitted into a train of cattle trucks. And next to the army barracks, which is why this was chosen, is a railway line. And so that's where the people were taken. And you can see here, Jewish people from Belgium arriving at the camp. On the left is taken a photograph that I took outside the museum that's next door to the fort where the Jews were taken. And on the right-hand side, this is taken the arrival at Auschwitz. I don't know where this particular group of people had come from, but you can see the cattle trucks, and they've just arrived and they're being processed at Auschwitz. The Belgian authorities and the Nazis kept very detailed records that we were able to look at. And you can see that there were 26 transports that left that Mechlin. They kept records of the date, the transport numbers, the number of men, the number of boys, the number of women, the number of girls, and the total. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that once they had done a roundup and collected about 1,000 people, then they would put them on a train. And you can see the dates in 1942, the activity of clearing Jewish people out of Belgium was very rapid. Willy's dad was on Transport 7, and his mother managed to avoid transportation until the penultimate transport, Transport 25. Transport Z was not Jewish people, it was for Roma or Gypsy. The German word Zigeuner is the German word for Roma or Gypsy. Otherwise, it was all Jewish people. So next to the fort, the army barracks, where the Jewish people were taken, the Belgians of today have created an amazing Holocaust museum called the Caserne d'Ossat. Massive, massive museum. It's 4 floors tall, and the walls are covered in photographs of the 25,000 Jews who were taken away. And the sepia colored photographs are those who survived, and the gray perished. Now, I didn't realize it, but this was the first Holocaust museum that Willy had ever visited in his life. The thought of going to a Holocaust museum or a Holocaust commemoration event, such as Yom HaShoah or Holocaust Memorial Day, Willy did not have the emotional strength to do it. But he did go to this museum, but after a short time, he had to leave. He just couldn't cope with it all. We found photographs of his parents and the members of his family who never returned. And until that moment, he hadn't seen photographs of his family or his parents. I went around the whole of the museum, which was quite a chilling experience. Here's one of the exhibits. This is the ID card that a Belgian Jew had to carry around with him. And as you can see, it has the word Jew stamped on it. After the Jews had been rounded up and arrived at this Mechlin, the Belgians and the Nazi Germans took great pleasure in humiliating people. And they took photos. And this is a photograph of the humiliation of Jewish men. And this was convoy number 8. You can see how they kept records. This is the convoy after Willy's father was taken away. And here's another photo. These are all on display at the museum, showing how Jewish people were publicly humiliated. So we had a very full schedule visiting these museums and archives. And on the Sunday, when the museums and archives were closed, Willy decided he wanted to go and visit the homes that he and his family had lived in. They'd been forced out of and had taken away from them. So he knew the addresses, and here are the homes that he'd lived in. We don't know who's living there now and how it comes that they're living there, and Willy's family has lost all of this. And walking around the streets that Willy remembers going to was another very emotional experience. You know, standing outside a home that the last time you saw it was when you walked out of it with your dad to go for a walk and you never went back there. So he was quite drained. And it was a sunny day, and we'd brought a packed lunch, and I suggested we find a local park. So I got out Google Maps and said local park, and we went to a local park, and we walked into the park, and Willy said, "This is the same park that the photo of him as a little boy and his parents and his aunt were taken." So far from it being a relaxing, pleasant lunch to get away from the upset and trauma, it was once again a very moving and emotional experience. I explained that this was the only photo that Willy had of his parents, and it was a photo that one of his sisters took with her when they went into hiding. And Willy didn't have proper portraits of his parents. And I told you that Willy's parents had to go and have their ID cards stamped with the word Jew. Well, these ID cards were issued when they arrived in the country. Willy was born in France, and that's where his parents came from. I mean, they were not born in France, but they went to Belgium for business opportunities. And when they arrived and it was peace and everything was fine, they had to have ID cards. And it was very clear from looking at the ID cards that people went to a great deal of trouble to make sure that the photographs were very nice. You can imagine perhaps the ladies went to the hairdressers and wore their finest. And when we went to one of the archives where we saw the original ID photos, which were passport-size photos, this wonderful archivist agreed to do a high-quality scan of these tiny passport photos and presented Willy with these portraits of his parents, which was an absolute joy to him because he'd never had them before. So when we were in Belgium, we met some other key people that I'd like to tell you about. We met some other hidden children and a member of the Belgian resistance. We met Marcel Friedman, that is an academic, is a professor, a psychologist, and an expert educationalist. And he was a hidden child. He was traumatized being a hidden child. And he has written a professional book for psychologists about the trauma of being a hidden child. And here you can see he's presenting Willy with a signed copy of his book. We had a very interesting chat with him, which gave us even more of an insight. We also met this wonderful lady, Regina Schlusny, who also wrote her story. as a hidden child in Belgium. She's a few years younger than Willy, and she explains that apart from running the business that she does, she also goes into schools to tell children her story of being a hidden child during the war and what Belgium was like during the war. And she explained to us that she starts off telling her children when she goes into schools, she says that she had a good war. And she goes on to explain why. Her parents handed her over to the resistance to be placed in a Catholic family as a hidden child when she was a baby. So she was brought up during the war by a family, a Catholic family, who she thought was her family. There were hardships, but she had plenty to eat, and there were brothers and sisters to play with, and she knew nothing that she was a hidden child. And she says she had a good war. Her trauma started after the war. Her mother came back for her. Her mother had had the most dreadful experience. She had been hiding in Belgium, and she had had to flee from one place to another. And all in all, she had been hidden in 15 different places. So her mother was pretty emotionally damaged when Regina was reunited with her. This woman was a stranger to Regina. And Regina explained that when she went in to live with her mother, and her mother gave her some meat, she asked for a glass of milk. And Regina knew nothing about the levels of kashrut and not eating meat and milk. And her mother hit her round the face because this was the most dreadful thing to ask for. Regina didn't understand it. And so she said her nightmare of the war began after the war. As it happens, Regina married a man who was also a hidden child. And she explained to us that he relives his trauma every night. Every night of their married life, in the middle of the night, he screams out in his sleep, reliving the dreadful things that happened to him. Now, the other person we met, I mentioned her earlier, is Andre Gerlin Herzevici, the woman who, with others, rescued several thousand Jewish children during the Holocaust. And I explained earlier about the various books, and I told you there was a book that had Willy van Hammer and the number, and there it is there, and the other books that had all the different numbers, and there is Andre Gerlin with some of her children. This is after the war, just as they were about to be reunited with their parents, and this is her in the war with a German behind her. So we went to, I mentioned Regina Schlusny. She knows Andre Gerlin and arranged for us to go to Andre Gerlin's flat. And Andre Gerlin explained to us everything that she did during the war. We spent 2 hours with her. It was quite amazing. And Willy was able to thank her for saving his life. And that was the most emotional thing. Currently, Andre Gerlin is 98 years old. For Andre Gerlin's 90th birthday, one of the children she saved wrote a special song in her honor. And a few years earlier, Andre Gerlin went to Israel to be presented with the award of a righteous Gentile. And I'm going to play a video now of that song that was written for her. And this is the one that the screen will be black and you'll see some words, but there won't be any music until you see the keyboard. And In the video, you will see Andre Gerlin being presented with the honor of a righteous Gentile, and all of the men and women around her are hidden children whose lives she saved.
שנית, להמשיך במלאכה, ומדלת לדלת עברה, ובשקט בשקט לחשה, להכין מזוודונת, דובון ושמיכה. ולמחרת היא חזרה ואספה ילדים חרש חרש, יוצאים לטיול אל היער, בשקט, בסוד, ללטף אבזים ושפנים. והאם החיוורת שידעה נפנפה לילדים בחיוך של דמעות. מדמואזל אנדרה הובילה אותם יד ביד, על גבה, מתגנבת, לעתים בעגלה עם חציר שלבד דחפה. חיילים גרמניים, על פניהם ללא פחד חולפת, הם שלחו לה קריצה, היא הייתה באמת כה יפה. את לא מפחדת, שאלו אותה הידידים, אני בת 20 ענתה, ובגיל 20 אסור שיכירו חלילה שם בחוץ שעצוב שלבד שכואב. והרבה אנשים אמיצים בביתם אז הסתירו תוך סיכון חייהם מול גסטאפו, מול כל הזוועות, ילדים שניצלו, שלנכד יזכירו, ילדים ללא צל שלמדו איך בוכים בלי דמעות. את לא מפחדת? שאלו אותה הילדים. אני בת 20 ענתה, ובגיל 20 לא מפחדים. היא הייתה בת 20, צעירה ניצה מבריסל. היא היום בת 90, אך תמיד תישאר.
Now, by pure coincidence, the time we were in Belgium coincided with Yom HaShoah, the annual Jewish commemoration of the Holocaust. And so we attended a couple of events. Firstly, in Brussels. And you can see, bottom right hand, there is Willy. And remember, Willy had never been to a Holocaust memorial event before. And he was asked to sit in a special section honouring hidden children. As Willy's parents were murdered in Auschwitz, they don't have a grave. And Willy had no idea that at this National Holocaust Memorial, all of the names of the 25,000 people who had been murdered in Auschwitz have their names engraved on the side. So that was another very moving and emotional time that Willy discovered their names on what is the equivalent of their grave. So that was in Brussels on the 28th of April. And then a few days later, on the 8th of May, we were in Antwerp and we went to another Holocaust memorial event there. And at the bottom left-hand side, you can see the Jewish Boys Choir. And I mentioned for you to remember what the choir in the Catholic chapel looked like with all the blonde hair. Well, mostly you can see there, the boys there do not have blonde hair. And it made us wonder how much the Jewish children stuck out when they were hidden, in inverted commas, in these schools. And once again, the risks that non-Jewish people took, and particularly this amazing network of Catholic priests and schools that hid Jewish children. So I think you have an idea of what happened to Willy and his family. So after the war, after the liberation, Willy was taken to France because he was born in France. So he was a French citizen. So he was once again uprooted. He went to France. He stayed in some kind of orphanage, school, residential place for about a year until the Red Cross was able to reunite him with his 3 sisters. When he went into hiding, he only had 2 sisters. He then went to Australia. The authorities had discovered that there was an uncle who survived, who went to Australia. And also, tragically, there was another uncle who had survived, who came back to Belgium, and he thought that nobody was left in his family. And he thought he was on his own and that everybody had been murdered. and so he committed suicide. But there was one uncle who went to Australia, and so Willy and his sisters were sent to Australia with the hope that the uncle would take them under his wings and look after them. But he didn't have the size house or resources to do that. So Willy and his sisters were placed in an orphanage. And Willy, who was about 14, 15, had to take on the role of the head of the family. By that stage, he spoke Flemish, French, and German. He had to learn English, and he learned English at high school. He then went to university and got a good degree in engineering, and then worked for RCA. And he then became interested in things to do with Israel. And he decided he was going to make Aliyah. So he went to Israel, added another language to his repertoire and learnt Hebrew. He was in the Navy and was in special operations, and he tells me that is a period of his life he's not allowed to talk about. He discovered diving, and he was the first person to set up a diving school in Eilat. He started it with a hut on the beach and built it up to be a very large diving school called Aquasport. So if you ever go to Eilat and you find Aquasport, that is the school, an organization that Willy set up. He sold it a number of years ago. He married Marilyn in Israel. Marilyn was the music librarian for the Israel Philharmonic. They had 2 sons. And after Marilyn and Willy retired, they decided to go and live in Toronto, which is where Marilyn was from. And there is Marilyn and Willy and their 2 sons, Lauren and Daniel. And Willy, who is now 89, I think, he has a great time traveling, painting, giving talks about his experience in the Holocaust. He has become an amazingly accomplished artist. This is a painting he did for us that hangs up in our house. If you want to hear Willy tell the story himself, he has recorded it, and you can log into the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and hear Willy talk for himself. So if you have any questions, I will do the very best to answer them. I will now try and stop the share. Okay, I've now stopped the share.
Okay, Melvyn, you know, what an amazing story. I mentioned to you whilst we were just having a chat before we started that we've been going for nearly 5 years. Now, during that time, we've had a variety of speakers, all very interesting in very different ways, different stories to tell, different experiences. But occasionally we get one that I think just takes our breath away. And I think this has taken my breath away. It's just amazing, you know, the quick thinking of his father, you know, within a matter of minutes that saved his life and changed the world for him. When you put up pictures like the Holocaust Museum and that wall of photographs where you've got the majority black and white and just a few in sepia, just shows you, you know, the number of people that were killed and the few that survived. It's just an amazing story, isn't it? And, you know, when you see things like the yellow star and the stamp of Jew on an identity card, you know, we never get used to seeing those things, and we should never get used to seeing those things. You know, the restriction on Jews, the story doesn't ever get any easier for us, does it? It's just a reminder. And I always say, and we've had stories before about the Holocaust survivors, how we must never forget and never stop reminding people. And I think the story that you have told us today reminds us, and I hope you're telling that story to many people, and I hope Willy goes on telling his story, because it's such tragedy and such awful happenings that the world must never forget that. But thank you for a most interesting talk, and I'm not going to go any further because there might be 1 or 2 people out there who would like to ask you some questions. So anybody would like to ask Willy some questions, sorry, Melvyn some questions, please I think you've all been unmuted, so one of you or any of you out there? I can't see you, so I can't see all of you, so I don't know. Anybody, if you want to unmute yourself, if you want to ask Melvyn a question?
What happened to his 3 sisters?
Very good question. They also went into hiding. 2 of them were smuggled over the border into Switzerland. And the way that they got over and adults got over, they didn't go with members of their family. They were handed over to this resistance organization. And the Swiss authorities would accept adults if they had a child, making the assumption that the adult was the parent of the child. So the children were paired up with adults they did not know to cross the border because it was a ticket to save the adult as well. So they were hidden in Switzerland, 2 of them, and one of them was hidden in a convent somewhere in Belgium.
Okay, any more?
Stayed in Australia, did they?
I'm sorry?
Did they stay in Australia?
I
He
think
went
they
to
went to Israel. They went to Israel.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, if there's anybody else, if not, anybody else? Go on.
Angela. Hi, Melvyn. I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely fascinating story, gripping and emotional and absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much.
And for those of you who don't know, Linda is a real cousin.
On the other side.
On the other side, yeah.
One of your group is she?
I think so, yeah.
One of about 30 or 40, I think, Melvyn.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
All right, look, I'm going to cut it there, I think.
Just a minute, Angela, you have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Which Angela?
Angela Doctors, unmute yourself. Go on. No, you're muted. Unmute yourself.
That's
Okay,
it, go on.
is it all right now? Thank
Go
you
on,
for a
yep.
wonderful, just wanted to thank you for the wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, somebody mentioned that Willy's sisters may have gone to Israel. Did they manage to keep in touch in their later lives?
Yes, they did.
Oh, how lovely. I'm happy about that. Wonderful, wonderful talk. And that singing, I mean, that was just incredible. That young woman singing, it was wonderful.
Very moving song, yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, all right.
Can I ask one thing?
Go on, carry on.
The crossing into Switzerland, that was with non-Jewish families? Or with Jewish families?
No, that would be, that's a good question. I think that's non-Jewish.
Oh, because I thought the Swiss accepted some Jews as well.
Yeah, I will try and check that out. I'll try and check that out. Yeah.
Sorry, it was just something I was interested in.
Every time I give a talk, there's questions that I think I need to find out. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay.
Melvyn, just a minute. Melvyn, this is Daphne.
Hello, Daphne.
And I want to just say thank you so much. After all the messing around we've had, it was the most wonderful talk, so fascinating.
Right.
And thank you so much. And I'm sorry to have messed you around.
No, you don't have to apologise at all.
I think you've apologised. I think you've apologised enough there, Daphne.
Yeah, I have, non-stop.
Okay, Melvyn, again, thank you.
Someone's talking.
All right, go on.
Can I just say one word?
Yeah.
That I found this most incredible talk and very emotional because my father came from Belgium, from Antwerp, and he was also known as Willy here, Willy Turner, but he was known as Guillaume in...
Did you know Liz Mayer's father came from Antwerp?
Go on, carry on.
Yeah,
Carry on.
anyway, and he
He's talking now.
gave me a love of languages because he spoke 7 languages: Flemish, Yiddish, French, German, Dutch, English, and Yeah, and one other one. And I mean, he was an amazing man. He worked in Hatton Garden, having worked in the diamond business in Belgium. And my mother was from Germany, and he escaped in 38. Thank God.
Yeah.
And that made me so grateful when I was.
Good. Okay.
Well, they left it.
Okay.
Wonderful speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, Melvyn, thank you so much for that.
Well,
Just
thank
to
you for
remind
listening.
just to remind everybody, next week we have another great talk in our series. Sue Gill is back talking about how Israel changed my life. So good afternoon, everybody. Keep well. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye-bye, Melvyn. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.